welcome to the first edition of But Wait, There's More. I've thought about doing this before. I'm going to do it now. The full disclosure news and commentaries have gotten to the point where whatever I'm talking about, people begin to talk about. People respond. And then people respond to the responses, and that's wonderful. And then once in a while I forget something really important. So often after the full disclosure news and commentaries, we're going to have the next day probably an episode of But Wait, There's More. First off, how could I be remiss, and this is an apology for me, to forget to mention that Peachstate is having its 11th anniversary show this Saturday. I am a big fan of this because I am of the belief, and I hope this is true, and from what I've heard, it should be true, that they're going to go back to emphasizing heat and emphasizing the kind of things that will get their audience, their core audience that have been with them fucking forever, and who are still, maybe they're laying dormant right now, but they're still the craziest, most insane fans in the Georgia scene. And I, for one, am looking very much forward to this alteration of direction for Peachstate. Will this mean the death of the babyface versus babyface 30-minute match? Fuck, let's hope so. But let them get one more out of their system, I suppose. But what are we here to fucking talk about? Viral Pro is pissed off because, you know, what you see is not real, right? The video that you're basing it on, and it's interesting that the assumption is that I'm basing the fact that they put up they claim a number of 325, but you look at that video, right? The video that they claim that I'm basing my thing entirely off of, right? That's a nice assumption. But they should be embarrassed about that video because that video shows far less than even 100 people. Their claim is, well, it didn't get over to the bleachers, and in the bleachers, apparently in the bleachers there were 250 fucking people. No, there weren't. No, there isn't. And it never happened, right? Will the people at Viral Pro, would you put your hand on a Bible or Quran or whatever the fuck and swear? Of course you wouldn't, because it's not true, unless you didn't believe that swearing would hurt you. But here is an example of the kind of messages I received. Now, I'm used to, whenever I state a very strong opinion or try to bring something to light, I get inundated with messages, right? And honestly, I get a little pit in my stomach when I get messages from people that I tend not to hear from very much, because it's inevitably somebody who's very upset, right? And they're going at me, and it tends to get very personal. And it is what it is. It's part of my gig. It's part of putting light on the darker sides of Georgia wrestling, right? I know it's going to happen. And sometimes it's people who have legitimate complaints, and I'm always down to hear those. But this was different. I thought it would be a lot of people. Now, some people representing Viral or who are very pro-Viral or disagreed with what I said commented on the video itself on YouTube. But the messages that I received on Facebook, and one strangely through Twitter, which is very weird because my Twitter is a very infrequent thing. I don't check it very often. I rarely post on it. Anyway, the gist was this, and again, this is something I found very interesting. You know, that the Viral show in particular that we're talking about, the tournament, right? Which to me was kind of a weird format, and when you read that show recap, there's something really weird about it, but it makes sense. Apparently, it's a fan who paid for that thing. Weird. Weird. That's weird thing number one, right? And that show lost money. Now, if you look at that roster, I can sort of ballpark. I've been doing this long enough. I did it long enough. I still keep in contact with people who do it, right? Who pay wrestlers and things like that. If you're drawing 325, how do you lose money on that bucket show? Apparently money was lost, and this fan, Mark, who put up the money, was very upset about that and very upset about the size of the crowd. So is this fan who put up the money upset because they drew 325 at least $10 a ticket, which should have more than covered the cost of everything? That doesn't make sense, does it? Huh. Apparently the organizers that paid for this show were very disappointed in the crowd size, and understandably so if they lost money. They didn't get 325, folks. I don't care what argument people want to try to make. None of that makes sense, right? And by the way, out of the people that I heard from, who I'm not going to reveal, because they trusted me to not say anything, but I'll ask you this, just something to think about. How would I be privy to how the organizers of this show felt? Could it be that one of the people telling me this was one of the people who was involved with the organizing of this show, who lost money on the show? I don't know. So the videotape is inaccurate. I mean, so let me just weigh this for you really quickly. The videotape, which blatantly shows a crowd that doesn't even approach 100, is wrong, because it didn't show, because goodness knows that when fans are given a choice, they will sit up in the bleachers rather than taking the seats closer to the ring. What the fuck? And people who organize a wrestling show, goodness knows what they love is people sitting up in the bleachers rather than filling up the ringside area. Oh my God, the boys love it. The boys love it when, you know, way off in the distance, the bleacher. What the fuck are we talking about here, folks? Who are you fooling? Who do you think you're fooling? You know, that's the last step. Like, one of my goals, and I'll just be blatantly honest about this, is to uncover the hypocrisy of different wrestling promotions. And two, is to destroy some of the worst practices of wrestling promotions. One of them being not saying what their crowds are at all, and then secondly, lying about them. There's no need for this shit, and I'm going to go after it at every opportunity. And if that pisses people off, or if people want to have some kind of backhanded argument that has nothing to do with anything, well, PCW used to always... You're right. Here, I'm going to tell you a little story, and that's how we're going to close this thing. And Viral Pro, sorry, no one's convinced, except for the people who have a vested interest, so they think, into lying about this thing. Were there some fans... Here, I'll concede this. Were there possibly some fans in the bleachers that were not caught on that video? Sure. Is that the only bit of evidence that I had about determining the size of your crowd and what it really was? No. Is one of my sources about the nature of that show that it was a fan putting up the money, and that the different people who organized this show were disappointed, very disappointed in the crowd size, and very disappointed that it lost money? Were one of those people the source that I had? One of the sources, yes. So what now? So what is more likely? Let me just spell it out for you. What is more likely? That viral, has escalated the size of its crowd, culminating with this last one, which was around 100, and I'm being generous, but saying it was 325. Then when presented with videotaped evidence, found some way to say that, no, it's just that way less people were sitting in the seats closer to the ring than went up into the bleachers to sit. And one of the organizers of the event, who had a financial stake in the outcome, expressed to me disappointment in the crowd size and the fact that they lost money. All that's more probable than we had a small crowd than we wanted and we lied and said we had a bigger crowd, and actually that show made a ton of money. Fucking Jesus. Viral, I gotta just, I'm just saying this for the benefit of other promotions, right? Because wrestling stems from a carnival tradition of con men and liars and criminals who had nowhere else to go. And that's one of the things I love about it. I'll just be honest. It's dirty, scummy business. But it doesn't mean it has to stay that way. And the surest way in this day and age to not be one of the ones who's riding the crest of this boom that's happening in Georgia wrestling right now is to ruin your own reputation. Are people going to lose money on wrestling shows? Yes. Are people going to suffer smaller crowds than they would like? Absolutely. But this notion that you can just lie your way out of everything, when now there are checks and balances, and I think that the reaction to me and the reaction to the sort of way that Tipping Point has changed, and the reaction to, you know what, you need to put your crowds and you need to make them somewhat accurate. Of course, wrestling people and people involved in wrestling promotions don't like it because it's the way that it hasn't been, right? When we had one of the biggest reactions I got was sort of an offhand comment I made in a video about how one of, Anarchy's biggest stars was grossly underpaid, and it was just a throwaway comment that I made. That got the biggest amount of comments to me privately, and it's because there's always been this notion that you don't talk about money in wrestling, right? But who does that give power to? Not the boys, yeah? And I'll just be upfront. Did PCW pay the wrestlers? Not the ones I trained. I consider that part of their training. I charged very little to train them in the first place, and every one of them will attest to this. And my goal was, I'm going to put you on a show, and none of these shows are designed to draw huge crowds or make money. We were running shows all the time. It was to get them reps in front of a crowd and to teach them how to work an angle and all this other stuff. Regardless of that, all the agreements that I ever made with the boys, I lived up to. Yeah. But it's a changing time. Yeah. And sorry that I have a vocal voice. One thing that I found to be really great is people who comment about wrestling all throughout the Southeast. I'm talking Georgia, Tennessee, Carolinas, Florida, are now contacting me privately and expressing how much they like what I do. And they send me links to their stuff, and I'm going to listen to them as well. And I'm going to no doubt become a fan and like what they do. And here's why. Because there's always been this notion that if you speak up or speak out, quote unquote, create drama, right? I'm not creating drama. I'm just putting puzzle pieces together and connecting dots in a way that hasn't been done. Now, some people will say I'm full of shit, and some people say that I'm not qualified. But at the end of the day, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing because I think it serves a vital interest. And if you're a hypocrite, if I perceive that you're a hypocrite, if I perceive that you're somebody who's using the wrestlers, using and unjustly manipulating your audience, or if you're just a fucking swindler or a crook or someone who's full of shit or completely ignorant, I'm going to call you out. Of course, most of what I say are opinions, and people are welcome to disagree with them. But if you're going to come at me with some kind of counter to something I said, evidence is the surest way to do it. Not theory, not conjecture. And I got to warn you, if you come at me publicly, your biggest fear anymore is not me retaliating in kind. You will find that all the people that are discussing me or talking around me or taking sides on issues that I bring up, you notice that I rarely comment on any of them. You know why? Because it's gotten to the point where people are messaging me privately. Am I saying I'm the voice of the people or some shit like that? No. But I think people sense that I, one, don't have a vested interest in things. I mean, I get Gary Lamb's position, his public position about what I said about the end of that Southern Honor show. I completely understand it. It's his job. His job is to defend his guys. I get it. But at the end of the day, I'm saying what I see. And my goal is to educate. His job is to promote. His job is to defend. My job is to educate. The best way I see how. Viral. You could take this as Stephen Platinum's trying to destroy us. I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm just pointing out the fact that you're engaging in something that's foolish. And if it's true that it's some fan or some mark that's put up money and then there's a group of people who thought that they were going to make this killing on wrestling and are disappointed that they got a small crowd, I mean, let me wake you up and smarten you up to the business right now. Getting into pro wrestling as a money-making venture is foolhardy. But then subsequently lying in order to make it seem like you pulled off this huge success is foolhardy. Yeah? Better and bigger people than you have done it before. That's your lesson learned. Yeah. But wait, there's more. This was episode 1. Best of luck to the shows running this weekend, especially to Peachstate. Really rooting for that show to do well, and I hope the news next week is good. I hope that I get to talk about these shows, and they're giving me crowd numbers, and all the rest of it. And I hope when they give me those crowd numbers, you know, that they're accurate, because it's so much more fun to kind of see where people are at. Don't think for a minute that I only talk about the ones that get the biggest crowds. Hear this and understand this. I try to present everything in context as well. APW was a place that used to get crowds in the 30s and 40s. So when they got 180, it didn't matter that there were shows that did more. I made a big deal about that, you know? In any case, I'll talk to you guys later on. I'm excited to see what kind of reaction this video gets. I do find it interesting that something else that 2 of the people told me who talked to me about the viral thing is that, and independent of each other, these are not 2 people who who like work together on anything, right? They're just 2 people that are in the know for very different reasons at viral. And like 2 out of the 3 don't even work for whatever the fuck. They both said something really interesting, which is Viral is obsessed with thinking that PWX fakes its numbers. Interesting, though. But I'll tell you, and Brett Wolverton works for both Viral and PWX. And when Brett Wolverton submitted that last report about PWX, and he listed that crowd size, by the way, he used a very specific number that sort of lends a little more credence to the con, at least. But Brett Wolverton is a guy that I like a lot, and who I respect a lot, and I would take him at his word for the crowd that he listed at PWX. I noticed they said paid, right? That's the number of people who theoretically bought a ticket to see that show. Now, if Brett Wolverton contacts me and says, "Oh, Steve, I was at Viral and it was 325, and I know that for sure," I'll issue an apology. But I think he has too much integrity to do that. Just my guess. But wait.